You know what's bizarre? There's an entire generation sitting on more wealth than millennials could dream of, yet they behave like they're one missed paycheck from disaster. They'll drop $600 on concert tickets without blinking, but they're still driving a 17-year-old Honda with duct tape holding the bumper on. They've got $80,000 in savings and still check their bank account before buying groceries. It's 1987. You're 12 years old. Your dad walks into the kitchen after work, drops his briefcase on the counter. Same company, same paycheck, same mortgage payment for the next 18 years. Everything's on schedule. Flash forward to 2009. You're 34. You did everything right, and you just watched your entire 401k cut in half while your company starts handing out pink slips to people who've been there since you were in high school. The formula was a lie, and that moment broke an entire generation's brain in the most interesting way possible. Here's the promise Gen X was sold. Work hard, save consistently, stay loyal to your company. The pension handles retirement, the house appreciates, Social Security fills the gaps. It's a simple equation. Effort in, security out. And here's the timing problem nobody mentions. They graduated into the recession of the early 90s. Entry-level jobs that required 3 years of experience. Wages that hadn't kept up with their parents' generation. But okay, they adjusted. They bought homes in the early 2000s, right on schedule. Starter homes, 30-year mortgages, the American dream, quantified. Then 2008 happens. Home values crater. Retirement accounts vaporize. Companies that promised stability start laying off people who dedicated decades. The same people who told them the formula works. But here's the part that makes this different from every other economic downturn. Gen X didn't just lose money. They lost the belief that the system operates on the principles it claims to operate on. Boomers had time to recover. Millennials never believed the system in the first place. But Gen X? They were mid-game when the rules changed. They weren't young enough to pivot. They weren't old enough to be protected. So what does that do to the way someone thinks about money for the next 20 years? Here's the first weird behavior pattern. Gen X saves more aggressively than almost any other generation. Consistently. Obsessively. They've got emergency funds that could cover 8, 10, sometimes 12 months of expenses. And they're simultaneously the most anxious about retirement. Not a little worried. Terrified. 70% of them say they don't think they'll have enough. But they're also maxing out 401s. Funding IRAs, building side income streams. They don't believe it'll work, but they do it anyway. That's not pessimism, that's adaptation. Psychologists have a term for this, defensive pessimism. You assume the worst case scenario, prepare obsessively for it, and when it happens, you're covered. It's exhausting. But for Gen X, it's kept them alive. Because here's what happened in their formative financial years. They watched institutions promise security, then break those promises without consequence. Pensions disappeared. Layoffs happened to loyal employees. The stock market crashed twice in a decade. Housing became a trap instead of an asset. The lesson wasn't don't save. The lesson was saving won't protect you the way they said it would. So now they save anyway. Not because they trust the system, because they know they can't. But here's where it gets even stranger. Gen X pioneered something we now call the side hustle, except they didn't call it that. They just quietly built secondary income streams while keeping their full-time jobs. They're not trying to quit the 9-to-5 and follow their passion. They're building escape tunnels. Your Gen X neighbor who flips houses on weekends? They're not doing it because they love real estate. They're doing it because they watched their colleague get walked out with a cardboard box after 22 years of loyalty. The Federal Reserve data shows Gen X has higher rates of self-employment and secondary income than both boomers and millennials. But most of them never quit their day jobs. It's not ambition, it's insurance. They'll quit a Fortune 500 company via email, but they'll drive across town for the coffee shop where the owner knows their order. Zero loyalty to institutions. Intense loyalty to people they trust. Because institutions betrayed them. People haven't. Or at least when people betray you, you can hold them accountable. When a corporation does it, you get a severance package and a form letter.
Think about it this way. Gen X will carry a $400,000 mortgage without hesitation, but they'll refuse to keep a $2,000 credit card balance for more than 30 days. The difference? Control. A mortgage is predictable. Fixed payment, clear timeline. You know exactly what you're dealing with. You can map it to completion. Credit card debt is chaos. It's quicksand. It compounds. It never ends. And they watched it swallow their parents whole in the 80s and 90s. So they'll leverage debt strategically for assets they believe will appreciate. Real estate, business investments, calculated moves. But buying a couch on credit, charging a vacation, that's the debt that kills you slowly, and they know it. The lesson wasn't never borrow. The lesson was only borrow what you can see the end of.
Here's where this psychology leaks into everyday decisions in ways that look completely contradictory. You know that person who has $60,000 in savings but won't replace their 15-year-old car even though the check engine light has been on for 6 months? That's not frugality. That's loss aversion that's been calcified by repeated betrayal. The car works. Replacing it feels like an unnecessary risk. What if the economy tanks next year? What if they lose their job? What if the new car is a lemon? Better to keep what's reliable, even if it's falling apart. But then, here's the contradiction. That same person will drop $500 on concert tickets, $2,000 on a weekend trip, $3,000 on live events and experiences without a second thought. Gen X spends more on experiences than any other generation in actual dollars, not percentages, dollars. They're financially paranoid and experientially extravagant at the same time. And it's the exact same psychology driving both. They save obsessively because systems can't be trusted. They spend on experiences because stuff can't be trusted either. Your house can go underwater. Your car loses value the second you drive it off the lot. Your possessions mean nothing when the economy collapses. But that concert in 1994, the trip you took in 2003, nobody can repossess those memories. The bank can't foreclose on an experience. You can't lose it in a market crash. It's actually brilliant when you think about it. They figured out that in an unstable economy, experiences give you better return on investment than things. Here's another one that confuses people. Gen X is the least likely generation to use traditional financial advisors. They'd rather research everything themselves, build spreadsheets, manage their own portfolios. But they're also the most anxious about whether they're doing it right. They don't want help, but they're terrified of messing up. Here's why. Gen X came of age when you could actually learn things from books. They're the last generation that believes self-education is legitimate. So they read financial books, they build models, they manage their own investments because they genuinely think they can learn how. But they also watched what happened when their parents trusted experts, advisors who put them in funds with hidden fees, pension managers who made promises they couldn't keep, companies that assured them their retirement was secure right before it vaporized. So they'll educate themselves, verify everything twice, trust no one's advice without doing their own homework first. It's not arrogance, it's self-defense. You know that person who keeps paper records of everything? Physical files, printed statements, documents in a fireproof safe? That's not being old-fashioned. That's redundancy by design. Gen X built the internet. They're not technologically illiterate, but they also remember when companies lost records, when databases crashed, when digital promises evaporated. They trust technology to work most of the time. They trust paper to work all of the time. Digital banking app? Yes. Paper statements? Also yes. Cloud storage? Sure. Fireproof safe? Obviously. It seems excessive until you've lived through multiple system failures. Now here's where this gets uncomfortable. The money system that Gen X adapted to, it's not the system that exists today. The behaviors that kept them alive, obsessive saving, loss aversion, distrust of institutions, DIY financial management, those were survival mechanisms for an economy that betrayed predictability. But the economy has shifted again, quietly, structurally. Today's system rewards different psychology. It rewards people who can tolerate volatility, who can leave money invested during crashes, who can think in decades instead of disaster timelines. It rewards people who never learned to be terrified. And that's the mismatch nobody talks about. Gen X spent 20 years building financial behaviors designed to protect against the last crisis. But the next 20 years will reward people who weren't shaped by that crisis. Here's what that actually looks like. Someone who saves obsessively in cash, they're protected against immediate disaster, but they're quietly losing to inflation. Every year, that emergency fund buys a little bit less. Someone who refuses to stay fully invested because they remember 2008, they're avoiding another crash, but they're also missing the compounding that happens between crashes. Someone who over-diversifies income streams to avoid dependence on any one source, they're protected against losing everything, but they're also spreading effort so thin that none of those streams ever become wealth generating. The system isn't punishing them, it's just misaligned with the psychology they built to survive it. Think about it this way. Gen X was told, work hard, save consistently, trust the formula. Then the formula broke, so they adapted. They built redundancy. They assumed nothing was safe. They prepared for everything. And now the system quietly rewards people who can do the opposite, who can concentrate risk, who can stay exposed during uncertainty, who can trust long-term incentives even when short-term chaos is screaming at them to pull out. That's not a moral judgment. It's a structural reality. The psychology that kept Gen X alive is now the psychology that limits their upside. And the cruelest part? They can see it happening. They know the math. They understand compounding. They read the books. They've done the research. But they can't override the instinct that was forged by watching the system lie. And that's where the cost shows up. Not in financial ruin. Gen X isn't broke. Most of them are doing fine by conventional standards. The cost shows up in the constant, low-grade anxiety that no amount of money ever fully resolves. Because when you've internalized that systems can't be trusted, there's no amount of savings that ever feels like enough. When you've learned that security is an illusion, every financial decision carries the weight of potential betrayal. They're not failing. They're just operating in a system that no longer aligns with the lessons they were forced to learn. So here's what Gen X money psychology really is. It's not confusion. It's not contradiction. It's not financial illiteracy or poor planning. It's adaptation to an economy that promised one thing and delivered another. They're not pessimists. They're realists who've been burned too many times to trust the optimistic narrative. They're not hoarders. They're people who learned that the only safety net you can count on is the one you build yourself. They're not contradictory when they save obsessively, but spend on experiences. They just figured out what's repossession proof. The system didn't fail Gen X in one dramatic moment. It failed them quietly, repeatedly, across 30 years. And they adapted the only way humans know how, by changing their behavior to match the reality they experienced. The formula was simple. Trust was broken, and everything after that makes perfect sense. If you recognized yourself in this, you're not alone. Drop a comment about which behavior hit closest. And if you want to understand the psychology behind money decisions that seem irrational but aren't, hit subscribe. Your money habits aren't random. They're responses to the world that shaped you. And honestly, Gen X's responses make perfect sense. If you want to know why next market crash will destroy anyone making under $50,000, click the left video. And if you want to know why Americans don't want kids anymore, click the right video. And I'll see you there in a second.